Hello and welcome to our capstone lectures. We've learned a number of different methods for summarizing data, including graphical displays and summary statistics, for understanding the natural variability in data and how to quantify it, for how to use probability models to understand the inherent randomness. We've learned how to investigate relationships among variables in data, and we've learned methods for inferring what we can about a population or about parameters in a theoretical world model. The purpose of the next few lectures is to apply what we've learned to a particular scientific investigation. The particular study that we're going to look at is the Canadian trial of carbohydrates and diabetes, which was concerned with how diet can be used to manage type 2 diabetes, with a particular focus on carbohydrates and the type of carbohydrate consumed. One of the first things that we said at the beginning of the course in our lectures is that in carrying out statistical work, it is essential to understand the context. The process of statistical inquiry is very much about the interplay between statistical methods and the subject matter for which the data were collected. And it's extremely important to always keep that context in mind while we're working. We're now going to take a look at the ideal sequence of steps in carrying out an investigation using statistical methods. The first is the formulation of clear, focused research questions, or perhaps one question. In order for the rest of the study to be done well, it's important to have a clear focus at the beginning. If research questions evolve with the study, as sometimes happens, it's then necessary to confirm them with future studies and new data. Studies using statistics are typically carried out for one of two reasons, either to build a model for making predictions or to enhance understanding by investigating where relationships among variables occur and what the nature of those relationships is. When the goal is the second of these, understanding relationships, it's important to specify one primary purpose or research question, usually by choosing one outcome variable that is of primary interest. In contrast, in data mining or machine learning, the goal is usually building predictive models from large amounts of data, often without an explicit research question. Data mining work tends to be more algorithmic than based on probability models and statistical properties, which is the type of work that we've done in this course. Once we've formulated clear research questions, the next steps are the following. We need to carefully design and implement a study to acquire relevant data that will help us answer our research questions. Once we've got that data, we'll need to clean it. We'll need to carry out analyses, which typically include both preliminary analyses and then formal final analyses. And finally, we'll need to interpret and present our results. In this video, we're focusing on the first step, formulating a clear research question. Since understanding the context is essential, our goal now is to understand the context of the study that we're going to be looking at. Let's start with carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are found in many foods, including fruits and vegetables, grains, dairy products, and sugary sweets. Your body uses carbohydrates to make glucose, which gives you energy. You may have heard of good carbs and bad carbs, with bad carbs being associated with refined white flour and added sugar, and good carbs associated with foods that are rich in fiber. In the study we're considering, carbohydrates were separated into two categories by their glycemic index, which is a measurement of how the glucose in blood responds after eating a carbohydrate-rich food. After eating a high GI food, blood glucose levels reach a sharp, quick peak and then have a fast decline. Low GI foods, in contrast, raise blood glucose levels lower and more slowly. The glycemic index of any food is affected by many things, including the type of starch, the fat and acid content of the food, and how it is processed and cooked. Foods that are easier to digest and are more highly processed tend to have higher GI ratings. For example, white bread has a higher glycemic index than pumpernickel bread. Because low GI foods are slower to digest and absorb, and they have smaller fluctuations in blood glucose associated with their consumption, there are many health benefits associated with eating low glycemic index foods. In particular, they help control blood glucose levels, which is of particular importance to diabetics, and they may in fact reduce the risk of type 2 diabetes. Eating low GI foods helps control appetite, and thus might have benefits for weight control. And they help control cholesterol levels and thus reduce the risk of heart disease. The study that we're looking at as our case study was designed to assess the effects of type of dietary carbohydrate, specifically low glycemic index versus high glycemic index foods. So we're classifying carbohydrates by what happens to blood glucose after they're consumed. And this study is particularly interested in subjects who have type 2 diabetes. So let's look a bit more at the connection between glucose and diabetes. Your body needs glucose to give itself energy. But to make this process happen, glucose needs insulin to provide a channel to cells through what are called insulin receptors. Insulin is produced in the pancreas. If a person's pancreas doesn't produce any insulin, then that person has type 1 diabetes. And the only treatment then is to take insulin. Now, if a person's pancreas does produce insulin, but there's not enough or the insulin receptors aren't working, so they don't create that channel for the glucose to get to the cells, then that person has type 2 diabetes. In type 2 diabetes, glucose builds up in the blood instead of being used for energy in the cells. And it's been shown that over time, having high blood glucose levels can lead to blindness, kidney problems, and other health problems, in particular heart disease, which is the cause of death for 80% of people with diabetes. And people with diabetes often tend to have more severe heart disease and develop it at a younger age than the general population. Which brings us back to the purpose of our study, the Canadian Trial of Dietary Carbohydrates in Diabetes, or CCD for short. So remember, the main purpose of CCD was to compare in subjects with type 2 diabetes the effect of dietary carbohydrates. The actual study compared 3 different diets, but we're going to focus on just 2. We'll come back to the third briefly later. We'll compare subjects who ate a high carbohydrate, high glycemic index diet with subjects who also ate a high carbohydrate diet, but with low glycemic index foods. And we want to see if there are any benefits to consuming the slow-release, low GI, low glycemic index foods. The CCD study followed subjects for 1 year in order to be able to assess the long-term effects. 1 year is an extremely long-term study for a nutrition study, which was one of the novel aspects of this one. Remember that our first step in the process of statistical inquiry was to formulate clear, focused research questions. So, are we there yet? If you answered no to the question, you're correct. We know that we want to compare people on a high GI versus a low GI diet. We know that we're particularly interested in people with type 2 diabetes. But we haven't yet indicated what we're comparing or how we'll define the benefits of a particular diet. There are 2 main ways in which we hope that improved diet will benefit people with type 2 diabetes. The first is better control of their diabetes, and the second is lower risk factors for heart disease. For the CCD study, the first of these, control of diabetes, was identified as the primary outcome or the main purpose of the study. Naturally, there is more than one way this could be measured, and the investigators chose HbA1c. HbA1c, or glycated hemoglobin is another name for it, measures the average amount of glucose in a person's blood over the last 3 months. The fact that it gives this long-term picture instead of a snapshot in time is why it is a preferred method of measuring how much a diabetic's disease is under control. Diabetics have higher levels of HbA1c than healthy people, and higher levels of HbA1c indicate less blood glucose control. So now we have a primary objective, to compare, in subjects with type 2 diabetes treated with diet alone, the effects of two diets. The first, high carbohydrate, high GI, and the second, high carbohydrate, low glycemic index, on blood HbA1c concentrations. I've slipped in here that the study is only going to look at type 2 diabetics who are treated with diet alone, so not taking any medication for their diabetes. We'll come back to this point later. It is expensive to carry out studies, especially on humans, so most studies consider many objectives in addition to their primary interest. These considerations are considered secondary objectives. For the CCD study, the secondary objectives included weight, side effects of the diets, other measurements related to diabetes management, and measurements of the risk of heart disease. The risk factors for heart disease that were considered included things like various measurements of cholesterol. We're going to look at one of these secondary measurements, and that's one of the risk factors of heart disease, and it is C-reactive protein. C-reactive protein, or CRP for short, is a protein in the blood, and high values indicate that there is some inflammation or swelling somewhere in the body. If there is no obvious source of swelling, say from an injury, it is often the case that the inflammation is caused by constricted arteries, so elevated levels of CRP are associated with greater risk of heart attack or stroke. At least one study has shown that CRP level more accurately predicts heart disease than cholesterol levels. The study also collected some basic information about the participating subjects, including sex, age, and BMI. We've seen BMI, or body mass index, as both an ordinal variable when it's been classified as underweight, normal, overweight, and so on, and we've seen it as a quantitative variable which can be calculated from height and weight. We're going to be working with the numeric value here. So to summarize, we're looking at the Canadian Trial of Dietary Carbohydrates and Diabetes, or CCD, in a little bit of a simplified version. We're interested in comparing subjects with type 2 diabetes on two different diets, a high GI diet and a low GI diet. Our primary objective is to compare HbA1c between these two diet groups. As a secondary objective, we're interested in comparing levels of C-reactive protein between these two dietary groups. So our response variables are our primary variable of interest, HbA1c, and also CRP of the secondary interest. Our main explanatory variable is diet, whether the subject ate a high GI or a low GI diet. And we have some other possible explanatory variables that we know about our subject, in particular sex, age, and BMI. In the next video, we'll talk about some design issues associated with planning this study.